Chapter 19. Home. I wondered if I would ever spend a night happier than this one. I doubted it. As she slept, Bella told me again and again that she loved me. More than the words themselves, the sound of perfect bliss in her tone was all I could ever want. I made her truly happy. Did that not excuse everything else? Eventually, in the very early morning, she settled into deeper sleep. I knew she wouldn't speak again. After finishing her book, one of my favorites now, too, I'd thought mostly about the day ahead, about Alice's vision of Bella visiting my family. Though I'd seen it clearly in Alice's head, it was hard to believe. Would Bella want that? Did I? I considered Alice's fairly well-developed friendship with Bella, of which Bella was completely ignorant. Now that I felt assured about the future I was pursuing, about the likelihood of it happening, it did feel a little cruel to keep Alice away from her. What would Bella think of Emmett? I wasn't 100% sure that he would behave himself. He would find it hilarious to say something off-putting or frightening. Maybe, if I promised him something he wanted. A wrestling match? A football game? There had to be a price he'd accept. I'd already seen how Jasper would keep his distance, but had Alice thought to tell him that? Or was her vision contingent on my action? Of course, Bella had met Carlisle, but it would be something different now. I found that the idea of Bella spending time with Carlisle was appealing to me. He was the very best of us. It could only make her think more highly of us all to know him better. And then, Esme would be ecstatic to meet Bella. The thought of Esme's pleasure almost had my mind made up. There was just the one obstacle, really. Rosalie. I realized there was prep work I absolutely had to accomplish before I could even think of bringing Bella home. And that meant leaving her. I gazed at her now, deep in her dreams. I'd moved to the floor beside her bed when she'd begun her nightly gyrations. I leaned against the edge of the mattress, one hand outstretched, a lock of her hair wrapped around my finger. I sighed and entangled myself. It had to be done. She would never know I'd left. But I would miss her for even this short interlude. I hurried home, hoping to conclude my tasks in the briefest time possible. Alice had done her part, as usual. Most of the things I wanted to accomplish were just details. Alice knew which were most vital, and sure enough, Rosalie was waiting on the front porch, perched on the top step of the stairs, as I ran up to the house. Alice had not told her much. Rosalie's face was a little confused when I'd first spotted her, as if she had no idea what she was waiting for. As soon as she caught sight of me, her confusion turned to a scowl. "Oh, what now?" "Rose, please," I called to her. "Can we talk?" "I should have realized Alice was just helping you." And herself, a little. Rosalie stood up, brushing her jeans off. "Please, Rose." Fine. Say what you have to say." I swept my arm out as an invitation. "Come for a walk with me?" She pursed her lips, but nodded. I led the way around the house, to the edge of the night-black river. At first, we were silent, as we paced north along the bank. There was no sound but the gush of the water. It was by design I'd chosen this path. I hoped it would remind her of the day I'd been thinking of earlier. The day she'd brought Emmett home. The first time we'd found common ground. "Can we get on with this?" she complained. Though she sounded only irritated, I could hear more in her head. She was nervous. Still afraid that I was angry about her bet? A little ashamed of that, I thought. I want to ask you a favor, I told her. It won't be easy for you, I know. This was not the direction she'd been expecting. My gentle tone only made her angrier, though.
You want me to be nice to the human?
She guessed. Yes. You don't have to like her, if you'd rather not. But she's part of my life, and that makes her part of your life, too. I know you didn't ask for this, and you don't want it.
No, I do not,
she agreed. You didn't ask my permission to bring Emmett home, I reminded her. She sniffed derisively.
That's different.
More permanent, certainly. Rosalie stopped walking, and I paused with her. She stared at me, surprised and suspicious.
What do you mean by that? Aren't you talking about permanence?
Her thoughts were so caught up with these questions. It took me by surprise when she spoke to a different subject.
Did you feel harmed when I chose Emmett? Did that injure you in any way?
Of course not. You chose very well. She sniffed again, unimpressed with my flattery. Could you give me the chance to prove that I have, too? Rosalie spun away from me, striding north again, breaking a path now through the untamed forest.
I can't look at her. When I look at her, I can't see her as a person. I just see a waste.
Against my intentions, I felt my anger flare. I bit back a growl and tried to compose myself. Rosalie glanced over her shoulder and saw the change in my expression. She paused again, swinging around to face me. Her features softened.
I am sorry. I don't mean that to sound so cruel. I just can't. I can't watch her do this. She's got a chance for everything, Edward,
Rosalie whispered, her whole body rigid with intensity.
A whole life of possibilities ahead of her. She's going to waste it all. Everything I lost. I can't bear to watch it.
I stared back at her, shaken. I'd been annoyed by Rosalie's strange jealousy, which indeed had roots in my preference for Bella. That part was all so petty. But this was something different, so much deeper. I felt that I understood her now, for the first time since I'd saved Bella's life. I reached out carefully to place my hand on her arm, expecting she would shake it off. But she just stood very still. I'm not going to let that happen, I promised, matching her intensity. She examined my face for a long moment. Then she pictured Bella in her mind. It wasn't the perfect representation of Alice's visions, more of a caricature, really. But it was clear what she meant. Bella's skin was white, her eyes bright red. The image was flavored with heavy disgust.
This is not your goal?
I shook my head, just as disgusted. No. I want her to have everything. I won't take anything away from her, Rose. Do you understand? I won't hurt her that way. She was unsettled now, too.
But how do you see that working?
I shrugged, feigning a nonchalance I didn't feel. How long until she grows bored with a 17-year-old? Do you think I can keep her interested until she's 23? Maybe 25? Eventually, she'll move on. I tried to control my face, to hide what the words cost me, but she saw through me.
This is a dangerous game you're playing, Edward.
I'll find a way to survive after she goes. I flinched, my hand falling to my side.
That's not what I meant,
she said.
Look, you're not up to my personal standards, But there's not a human man alive who can compare with you. And you know it.
I shook my head. Someday, she'll want more than I can give her. There was so much I couldn't give her. You would have wanted more, wouldn't you? If you were in her position, and Emmett in mine? Rosalie took my question seriously, thinking it through. She imagined Emmett just as he was now, his easy smile, his hands held out to her. She saw herself human again, still lovely, but less remarkable, reaching back to him. Then she imagined her human self turning away from him. Neither image seemed to satisfy her.
But I know what I lost,
she thought, her tone subdued.
I don't think she'll see it that way. I'm going to sound like an octogenarian now,
she continued aloud, the faintest hint of levity suddenly in her voice.
But you know kids these days.
She smiled weakly.
All about the here and now. No thought for 5 years into the future, let alone 50. What will you do when she asks you to change her?
I'll tell her why it's wrong. I'll tell her everything she'll lose.
And when she begs?
I hesitated, thinking of Alice's vision of a grieving Bella, her hollow cheeks, her body curled in on itself in agony. What if my presence, and not my absence, were the reason she felt that way? I imagined her full of Rosalie's bitterness. I'll refuse. Rose heard the iron in my tone, and I could see that she finally understood my resolve. She nodded to herself.
I still think it's too dangerous. I'm not sure you're that strong.
She turned around and started walking slowly back toward the house. I kept pace with her. Your life isn't what you wanted, I began quietly. But in the last 70 years or so, would you say you've had at least 5 years of pure happiness? Flashes of the best parts of her life, all of them revolving around Emmett, moved through her head. Though I could see that, obstinate as ever, she didn't want to agree with me. I smiled half-heartedly. 10 years, even? She wouldn't answer me. Let me have my 5 years, Rosalie, I whispered. I know it can't last. Let me be happy while happiness is possible. Be part of that happiness. Be my sister. And if you can't love my choice the way I love yours, can you at least pretend to tolerate her? My words, gentle and quiet, seemed to hit her like bricks. Her shoulders were suddenly stiff, brittle.
I'm not sure what I can do. Seeing everything I want, out of my reach, it's too painful.
It would be painful for her. I knew that. But I also knew that her regret and sorrow wouldn't equal even a fraction of the anguish that was waiting for me. Rosalie's life would go back to what it was now. Emmett would be there throughout to comfort her. But I would lose everything. Will you try? I demanded, my voice sterner than before. Her walk slowed for a few seconds, and her eyes were on her feet. Finally, her shoulders slumped and she nodded.
I can try.
There's a chance. Alice saw Bella coming to the house in the morning. Her eyes flashed up, angry again.
I need more time than that.
I held my hands up, placating. Take the time you need. It made me sad and tired to see that her eyes were suspicious again. Maybe she wasn't strong enough. She seemed to feel the judgment in my gaze. She looked away, then suddenly ran for the house. I let her go. My other errands did not take so long, nor were they as difficult. Jasper agreed easily to my request. My mother was glowing with happy anticipation. What I'd wanted from Emmett no longer applied. It was clear he'd be with Rosalie, and she'd be somewhere far from here. Well, it was a start. At least I'd gone into Rose to promise to try. I even took a second to put on fresh clothes. Though the sleeveless shirt Alice had given me long ago had not brought about any of the miseries I'd feared, and had brought some pleasures I hadn't anticipated, I still found it strangely distasteful. I was more comfortable in my usual clothes. I passed Alice on my way out, leaning up against the pillar at the edge of the porch steps, near where Rosalie had waited before. Her grin was smug.
Everything looks perfect for Bella's visit, just as I'd envisioned.
I wanted to point out that what she saw now was still just a vision, changeable as the first. But why bother? You are not taking Bella's desires into account, I reminded her. She rolled her eyes.
When has Bella ever said no to you?
It was an interesting point. Alice, She interrupted, already knowing my question.
See for yourself.
She pictured the intertwined ribbons of Bella's future. Some were solid, some insubstantial, some disappearing into mist. They were more ordered now, no longer snared into the messy knot. It was a relief that the most nightmarish of futures was entirely missing. But there, in the sturdiest thread, Bella of the blood-red eyes and diamond skin still held the most prominent place. The vision I was looking for was only part of the more nebulous lines, ribbons at the periphery. Bella at 20, Bella at 25. Flimsy-seeming visions, blurred around the edges. Alice wrapped her arms tight around her legs. She didn't need to read thoughts or the future to read the frustration in my eyes. That's never going to happen.
When have you ever said no to Bella?
I scowled at her on my way down the steps, and then I was running. Only moments later, I was in Bella's room. I put Alice out of my mind and let the calm of her quiet slumber wash over me. It looked as if she hadn't moved at all. And yet, my being away, even briefly, had changed things. I felt unsure again. Rather than sitting beside her bed, as I had before, I found myself back in the old rocking chair. I didn't want to be presumptuous. Charlie rose not too long after I had returned, before the first hints of dawn had even begun to light the sky. I felt confident, due to his usual patterns, and also his murky but cheerful thoughts, that he was going fishing again. Sure enough, after a quick peek into Bella's room that found her more convincingly asleep than she'd been the night before, he tiptoed downstairs and started rummaging through his fishing gear under the stairs. He left the house just as the clouds outside took on a faint gray luminosity. Again, I heard the rusty creaking of Bella's truck's hood. I flitted to the window to watch. Charlie propped the hood on the strut and then replaced the battery cables that he'd left dangling to the sides. It wasn't a particularly difficult problem to solve, but maybe he'd assumed that Bella wouldn't even attempt to fix her truck in the dark. I wondered where he'd imagined she'd want to go. After a brief moment of loading rods and tackle into the back of his police cruiser, Charlie drove away. I returned to my formal place and waited for Bella to wake. More than an hour later, when the sun was fully up behind the thick blanket of clouds, Bella finally stirred. She threw one of her arms across her face, as if to block the light, then groaned quietly and rolled onto her side, pulling the pillow on top of her head. Abruptly, she gasped, "Oh!" and lurched dizzily up into a sitting position. Her eyes struggled to focus, and it was obvious she was searching for something. I'd never seen her like this, first thing in the morning. I wondered if her hair always looked this way, or if I'd been responsible for the extraordinary mussing. Your hair looks like a haystack, but I like it, I informed her, and her eyes snapped to my position. Relief saturated her expression.
Edward, you stayed.
Awkward from lying still for so long, she struggled to get to her feet, and then bounded across the room directly toward me, flinging herself into my arms. Suddenly, my worries about presumption felt a little silly. I caught her easily, steadying her on my lap. She seemed shocked by her own impulsiveness, and I laughed at her apologetic expression. Of course, I told her. Her heart thudded, sounding confused. She'd given it very little time to adjust from sleep to sprint. I rubbed her shoulders, hoping to calm it. She let her head fall against my shoulder. I was sure it was a dream, she whispered. You're not that creative, I teased her. I couldn't remember dreaming myself, but from what I'd heard in other human brains, I rather thought it was not a very coherent or detailed thing. Suddenly, Bella bolted upright. I dropped my hands out of the way as she scrambled to her feet.
Charlie,
she choked. He left an hour ago. After reattaching your battery cables, I might add. I have to admit I was disappointed. Is that really all it would take to stop you, if you were determined to go? She rocked indecisively from her toes to her heels, her eyes flicking from my face to the door and then back again. A few seconds passed while she seemed to struggle with some decision. You're not usually this confused in the morning, I said, though it wasn't actually something I would know. I never saw her until she'd had plenty of time to wake up. But I hoped that, as she usually did when I assumed something, she would contradict me, and then explain whatever dilemma faced her. I held out my arms to let her know she was welcome. So extremely welcome, to return to me if she wished. She swayed toward me again, and then frowned.
I need another human minute.
Of course. I was sure I would get better at this. I'll wait, I promised her. She'd asked me to stay, and until she told me to go, I would be waiting for her. This time there was no long delay. I could hear Bella banging cabinets and slamming doors. She was in a rush today. I heard the brush tearing through her hair, and it made me wince. It was only a few moments until she rejoined me. 2 high spots of color marked her cheeks, and her eyes were bright and eager. Still, she moved more carefully as she approached me this time, and paused, unsure, when her knees were an inch from mine. She seemed unconscious of the fact that she was rarely wringing her hands. I could only guess she was shy again, that she felt the same unease after being separated that I had felt returning to her room this morning. And, as I was sure was true for me as well, there was absolutely no need for it. I gathered her carefully into my arms. She curled up willingly against my chest, her legs draped over mine. Welcome back, I murmured. She sighed, contented, her fingers tracing down my right arm, slow and searching, and then back up again while I rocked lazily back and forth, moving to the rhythm of her breathing. Her fingertips wandered across my shoulder, then paused at my collar. She leaned back, staring up at my face with a dismayed expression. You left? I grinned. I could hardly leave in the clothes I came in. What would the neighbors think? Bella's dissatisfaction only intensified. I didn't want to explain the errands I'd had to run, so I said the one thing I was absolutely sure would distract her. You were very deeply asleep. I didn't miss anything. The talking came earlier. As anticipated, Bella groaned. What did you hear? She demanded. It was impossible to hold on to my jocular mood. It felt as though my insides were melting into liquid joy as I told her the truth. You said you loved me. Her eyes dropped, and she pressed her face against my shoulder, hiding. You knew that already, she whispered. The heat of her breath saturated the cotton of my shirt. It was nice to hear, just the same. I murmured into her hair. I love you. The words hadn't lost their ability to thrill me. On the contrary, they were more overpowering now. It meant much to have her choose to say them, knowing I was listening. I wanted even stronger words, words that could accurately describe what she had become to me. There was nothing left inside me that wasn't entirely about her. I remembered our first conversation, remembered thinking then that I did not truly have a life. That was no longer the case. You are my life now, I whispered. Though the sky was still full of thick clouds, the sun buried deep behind them, the room somehow filled with golden light. The air turned clear, purer than the normal atmosphere. We rocked slowly, my arms around her, savoring the perfection. As I'd thought so often in the past 24 hours, I knew I would be totally satisfied with every part of the universe if I never had to move again. The way her body was melted against mine, I thought she must feel the same. But I had responsibilities. I needed to keep my unruly joy in check and be practical. I held her just a little tighter for 1 second, then forced my arms to relax. Breakfast time? I suggested. Bella hesitated, perhaps as averse as I was to allowing any space to come between us. Then she twisted her torso away from me, leaning back so I could see her face. Her eyes were round with terror. Her mouth fell open, and her hands flew up to protect her throat. I was so horrified by her obvious distress that I couldn't process what was happening. My senses flailed out wildly around us like tentacles, looking for whatever danger threatened. And then, before I could dive out the window with her in my arms and run for safety, her expression relaxed into a sly smile. I finally understood the connection between my words and her reaction, the joke she was making. She giggled. Kidding. And you said I couldn't act. It took me half a second to compose myself. Relief made me feel weak, but the shock also left me agitated. That wasn't funny. It was very funny, she insisted. And you know it. I couldn't help but smile at her. I supposed if vampire jokes were going to become a thing with us, I could bear it, for her sake. Shall I rephrase? Breakfast time for the human? She smiled blithely. Oh, okay. While I was willing to accept a future of bad jokes, I wasn't entirely ready to let her off the hook for this one. I moved with extreme care, but I didn't move slowly. I hoped she would be as shocked as I'd been, though definitely not as frightened, as I folded her over my shoulder and darted from the room. Hey! She complained, her voice bouncing with my movement, and I slowed slightly on the way down the stairs. Whoa, she gasped as I turned her upright and set her down gently on a kitchen chair. She looked up at me and smiled, clearly not shaken in the least. What's for breakfast? I frowned. I'd not had time to figure out the human food thing. Well, I knew the basics of what it should look like, at least, so I could probably improvise. I hesitated. I'm not sure. What would you like? Hopefully something straightforward. Bella laughed at my confusion and stood up, stretching her arms over her head.
"That's all right,"
she assured me.
"I fend for myself pretty well."
She raised one eyebrow and added, with an arch smile,
"Watch me hunt."
It was enlightening and alluring to watch her in her element. I hadn't seen her this confident and at ease before. It was clear she could have located everything she was looking for while wearing a blindfold. First a bowl, and then stretching up on her toes, a box of off-brand Cheerios from a high shelf. Spinning to tug open the fridge while also pulling a spoon from a drawer she then nudged shut with her hip. It was only after she'd assembled everything on the table that she hesitated.
"Can I get you anything?"
I rolled my eyes. Just eat, Bella. She took one bite of the inedible-looking slush and chewed quickly, glancing up at me. After she'd swallowed, she asked,
"What's on the agenda for today?"
I'd meant to work up to this, but I would be lying to her now if I said I had no ideas. What would you say to meeting my family? Her face blanched. Well, if her answer was no, that was that. I wondered how Alice had gotten it wrong. Are you afraid now? My question sounded almost as if I'd wanted her to say yes. I supposed I had been waiting for something that would be too much. The answer was obvious in her eyes, but she said,
"Yes,"
in a low, tremulous voice, which I hadn't expected. She never admitted when she was afraid. Or, at least, she never admitted when she was afraid of me. Don't worry, I'll protect you, I said, smiling half-heartedly. I wasn't trying to convince her. There were a million other things we could do together today that wouldn't make her feel as though her life was on the line. But I wanted her to know that I would always put myself between her and any danger, meteor or monster. She shook her head.
"I'm not afraid of them. I'm afraid they won't like me. Won't they be, well, surprised that you would bring someone,"
she frowned,
"like me home to meet them? Do they know that I know about them?"
A sudden pulse of unexpected anger rocked me. Maybe it was because she was right. About Rosalie, at least. I hated that Bella referred to herself this way, as though there was something wrong with her, and not the other way around. Oh, they already know everything, I said, and the anger was clear in my voice. I tried to smile, but I could tell it didn't soften my tone. They'd taken bets yesterday, on whether I'd bring you back. Though why anyone would bet against Alice, I can't imagine. I realized I was prejudicing her against them, but it was fair she should know. I tried to rein in my ire. At any rate, we don't have secrets in the family. It's not really feasible. What with my mind reading and Alice seeing the future and all that. She smiled weakly.
"And Jasper making you feel all warm and fuzzy about spilling your guts. Don't forget that."
You paid attention.
"I'd been known to do that every now and then."
She frowned, as if concentrating, and then nodded, almost as if she were accepting the invitation.
"So did Alice see me coming?"
Bella spoke in her matter-of-fact voice, as though our topic was quite mundane. I was surprised, though, because it sounded very much like she was agreeing to go to meet my family, as if Alice's vision meant there wasn't another choice. Her total acceptance of Alice's word as law touched my rawest nerve. I hated the possibility that even now, I might be ruining Bella's life. Something like that, I admitted, and turned my face as if I were looking out the windows into the backyard. I didn't want her to see how upset I was. I could feel her eyes on me and doubted I was fooling her. Forcing myself to fix the mood I'd created, I looked back to her and smiled as naturally as I could. "Is that any good?" I asked, gesturing to her cereal. "Honestly, it doesn't look very appetizing."
"Well, it's no irritable grizzly."
She trailed off when she processed my reaction, then focused on her food, eating quickly now. She was thinking hard about something, too, staring into a middle distance as she chewed, but I doubted our thoughts were in sync at this moment. I gazed out the windows again, letting her eat in peace. I looked at the small yard, remembering the sunny day I'd watched her there, remembering the darkness of the clouds overtaking her. It was too easy to slip back into that despair, to second-guess all my good intentions and see them as nothing but selfishness. I turned back to her in turmoil, only to find her watching me with fearless eyes. She trusted me, as she always had. I took a deep breath. I would live up to her trust. I knew I could. When she looked at me that way, there was nothing I couldn't do. Well, so Alice would be proven right in this one minor, simple prophecy. That was no surprise. I wondered how much of Bella's acceptance was just to please me. Probably the larger portion. There was something closely related that I very much wanted, but I worried that Bella would again agree just for my sake. Well, I could at least share my opinion and see how she reacted. "And you should introduce me to your father, too, I think," I said casually. She was taken aback.
"He already knows you."
"As your boyfriend, I mean." Her eyes narrowed.
"Why?"
"Isn't that customary?" I sounded at ease, but her resistance rattled me.
"I don't know,"
she admitted. Her voice was quieter, less sure, when she continued.
"That's not necessary, you know? I don't expect you to. I mean, you don't have to pretend for me."
Did she think this was an unwelcome chore I was undertaking for her sake alone? "I'm not pretending," I promised. She looked down at her breakfast, stirring the remnants of her cereal listlessly. Perhaps it was better to just get to the no. "Are you going to tell Charlie I'm your boyfriend or not?" Still looking down, she asked softly.
"Is that what you are?"
This was not the rejection I had feared. Clearly I was misunderstanding something. Was it because I wasn't human that she didn't think Charlie should know about me? Or was it something else? It's a loose interpretation of the word boy, I'll admit.
"I was under the impression that you were something more, actually,"
she whispered, face still lowered as if she were talking to the table. Her expression reminded me again of that charged conversation at lunch. How she'd thought our feelings were unequal, that mine were lesser. I couldn't understand how asking to meet her father had led her to this train of thought, unless... Was it the impermanence of the word boyfriend? It was a very human, fleeting sort of concept. Truly, the word didn't encompass even the smallest fraction of what I wanted to be to her. But it was the word Charlie would understand. "Well, I don't know if we need to give him all the gory details," I answered softly. I reached out with one finger to raise her face so that I could see her eyes. "But he will need some explanation for why I'm around here so much. I don't want Chief Swan getting a restraining order put on me."
"Will you be?"
she asked anxiously, ignoring my mild joke.
"Will you really be here?"
"As long as you want me." Until she asked me to leave, I was hers. She almost glared at me. So intense was her gaze. I'll always want you. Forever. I heard Alice's certainty again.
When have you ever said no to Bella?
I heard Rosalie's questions.
What will you do when she asks you to change her? And when she begs?
Rosalie was right about one thing, though. When Bella said the word forever, it didn't mean the same thing to her as it meant to me. For her, it meant merely a very long time. It meant she couldn't see the end yet. How could anyone who had lived only 17 years comprehend what 50 years meant, let alone eternity? She was human, not a frozen immortal. Within just a few years, she would reinvent herself many times over. Her priorities would shift as her world grew wider. The things she wanted now wouldn't be the things she wanted then. I walked slowly to her side, knowing my time was running out. I traced her face with my fingertips. She stared back at me, trying to understand.
Does that make you sad?
She asked. I didn't know how to answer her. I just watched her face, feeling as if I could see it changing infinitesimally with each passing beat of her heart. She never looked away. I wondered what she saw in my face, if she thought at all about how it would never change. The feeling of sand slipping through the neck of an hourglass only intensified. I sighed. There wasn't time to waste. I glanced at her nearly empty bowl. Are you finished? She stood up.
Yes.
Get dressed. I'll wait here. Without a word, she complied. I needed that minute alone. I wasn't sure why I was lost in so many ominous thoughts. I needed to get myself in hand. I had to grasp every second of happiness I was allowed. All the more because those seconds were numbered. I knew I had a great capacity for ruining even the best moments with my wretched doubts and endless overthinking. What a waste. If I were only to have a few years to spend any of them wallowing. Through the ceiling, I listened to the sound of Bella wrestling with her wardrobe. There was not as much commotion as 2 nights ago, when she was preparing for our trip to the meadow. But it was close. I hoped she wasn't too stressed about how she would appear to my family. Alice and Esme already loved her unconditionally. The others wouldn't notice her clothes. They would only see a human girl brave enough to visit a house full of vampires. Even Jasper would have to be impressed by that. I had pulled myself together by the time she ran back down the stairs. Just focus on the day ahead. Focus on the next 12 hours at Bella's side. Surely that was enough to keep me smiling.
Okay, I'm decent,
she called as she took the stairs 2 at a time. I caught her as she nearly collided with me. She looked up with a wide grin, and all my lingering doubts crumbled away. As I'd known she would be, she was wearing the blue blouse she'd worn in Port Angeles. My favorite, I supposed. She looked so pretty, and I liked the way she pulled her hair back. There was no way for her to hide behind it now. Impulsively, I wrapped my arms around her and held her close. I breathed in her fragrance and smiled. Wrong again, I teased. You are utterly indecent. No one should look so tempting. It's not fair. She pushed against my hold, and I loosened my arms. She leaned back just far enough to read my face.
Tempting how?
She asked, cautious.
I can change.
Last night, she'd asked me if I was attracted to her as a woman, though I felt it was so obvious as to be ridiculous. Maybe, somehow, she still didn't understand. You are so absurd, I laughed, and then kissed her forehead, letting the feel of her skin against my lips wash like a wave of electricity down the length of my body. Shall I explain how you are tempting me? Slowly, My fingers followed the length of her spine, discovering the curve at the small of her back, then resting atop the slope of her hip. Though I'd meant to tease her, I was soon lost in the moment as well. My lips brushed against her temple, and I heard my breath speeding to match her heart. Her fingers trembled against my chest. I only had to incline my head, and then her lips, so soft and warm, were just a hairbreadth away from my own. Carefully, wary of the power of the alchemy, I touched my lips to hers. While my whole body again overflowed with light and electricity, I waited for her reaction, ready to disengage if things got out of hand. She was more careful this time, holding herself nearly motionless. Even her trembling had stilled. Moving with what caution I could muster in the face of what I was feeling, I pressed my lips more firmly against hers, savoring their soft yield. I was not as much in control of myself as I should have been. I let my lips fall open, wanting to feel her breath in my mouth. Just at that moment, her legs seemed to give out, and she slid through my arms toward the floor. I caught her at once, holding her upright. I held up her head with my left hand. It rocked, loose on her neck. Her eyes were closed, and her lips white. "Bella," I shouted, panicking. She gasped in a loud breath, and her eyelids fluttered. I realized that I hadn't heard the sound of her breathing in a while, longer than was right. Another ragged breath, and her feet struggled to find the floor. "You," she sighed with her eyes still half closed, "made me faint." She had actually stopped breathing to kiss me, probably in a misguided attempt to make things less difficult for me. "What am I going to do with you?" I half growled. "Yesterday I kiss you, and you attack me. Today you pass out on me?" She giggled, choking on her own laughter as her lungs tried to pull in the necessary oxygen. I was still supporting most of her weight. "So much for being good at everything," I muttered. "That's the problem. You're too good." She took a deep breath. "Far, far too good." "Do you feel sick?" At least her lips had not gone green. A delicate shade of pink was creeping into them as I watched. "No," she answered, her voice stronger. "That wasn't the same kind of fainting at all. I don't know what happened. I think I forgot to breathe." I'd noticed. "I can't take you anywhere like this," I grumbled. She took another breath and then straightened into my arms. She blinked fast 5 times and lifted her chin into its most stubborn position. "I'm fine." Her voice was stronger, I had to concede, and the color had already come back into her face. "Your family is going to think I'm insane anyway. What's the difference?" I examined her carefully. Her breathing had evened out. Her heart sounded stronger than it had a moment ago. She seemed to be supporting her own weight without difficulty. The roses in her cheeks were getting brighter with every passing second, set off by the vivid blue of her blouse. "I'm very partial to that color with your skin," I told her. That made her blush even more intensely. "Look," she said, interrupting my scrutiny. "I'm trying really hard not to think about what I'm about to do. So can we go already?" Her voice was back to normal strength as well. "And you're worried, not because you're headed to meet a house full of vampires, but because you think those vampires won't approve of you, correct?" She grinned. "That's right." I shook my head. "You're incredible." Her smile widened. She took my hand and pulled me to the door. I decided it was better to pretend that the driving arrangements were already settled than to ask her about them. I let her lead the way to her truck, and then deftly opened the passenger door for her. She didn't object in any way. She didn't even glare at me. I felt this was a promising sign,